A black farmer walks into an airport showroom to purchase a jet, but instead of being welcomed, he faces racism and insults from the sales staff. Will cruel prejudices stand in the way of his dreams? This story is a powerful reminder of human value and the fight against injustice. Where are you watching this video from? Share in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this. Henry, a black man with the sun-kissed skin of a farmer, stepped out of his battered pickup truck in front of the airplane showroom at the Central Airport. His muddy boots, faded cap, and worn-out checkered shirt made him stand out starkly against the luxurious and modern surroundings. But he didn't care about that. Today was the day he decided to make his lifelong dream a reality, owning a private jet. Henry walked slowly inside, where gleaming aircraft were lined up like works of art. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Yet the attention he received wasn't curiosity or respect, it was cold judgment mingled with disdain. Salespeople in sharp suits looked him up and down. A young man, likely the manager, frowned and shook his head slightly, as if incredulous that someone like Henry would dare set foot here. Customers dressed to the nines didn't bother to hide their annoyance. A woman standing near the reception desk whispered to the person next to her, "What's he doing here? He looks like he just walked off a farm." A soft chuckle followed her remark. Henry felt every glance, every whisper, but instead of backing down, he held his head high and kept his gaze steady. He knew he didn't fit the typical image of someone buying a jet, no custom-tailored suit, no expensive watch, and no luxury car. But that didn't bother him. He had a dream, and today, he had the means to make it come true. Approaching the display area, Henry stopped in front of a small but elegant jet, its polished metal exterior gleaming under the overhead lights. He reached out to touch the plane's body, feeling the perfection of its craftsmanship. This wasn't just a mode of transport to him, it was a symbol of the hard work and success he had earned. Unbeknownst to him, this moment marked the start of the challenges he would face. In the corner of the room, a group of customers began exchanging glances, their whispers growing louder. "What does he think he's doing?" muttered a middle-aged man, loud enough for Henry to hear. "Probably imagining he's a pilot." Henry froze for a moment, his fists clenching as he steadied his nerves. He didn't respond, nor did he walk away. Instead, he remained where he was, gazing at the jet, silently reminding himself that he had every right to be there, just as much as anyone else. Little did Henry know, this was only the beginning of what would be a long and challenging day. He stood there, his eyes tracing every intricate detail of the airplane, his heart brimming with thoughts of the dream he had nurtured for so long. On the other side of the room, however, Carter, a young salesman, was fixated on Henry. Carter, with his slicked-back hair, perfectly pressed suit, and an air of self-assurance fitting for this glitzy world, didn't bother to hide the disdain etched across his face as he looked at Henry. Carter began to approach Henry slowly, each deliberate step echoing like a calculated assertion of dominance. His lips curled into a smirk, his cold eyes silently declaring that Henry didn't belong here. When he was close enough, Carter crossed his arms over his chest, tilted his head slightly, and began to speak. "Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right place?" Carter's tone was a blend of mockery and derision. His gaze swept over Henry, from the faded hat perched on his head to the simple shirt he wore, and finally, to the mud-smeared boots on his feet. "This is an airplane showroom, not a gas station." The words were not just sharp, they were laced with outright insult. Carter didn't need to say much more to make his disdain crystal clear. Henry slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting Carter's. But instead of retorting, he stayed silent, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his hand rested gently on the plane's surface as if drawing strength from it. His silence wasn't born of weakness, but of a deliberate choice to remain composed. Yet Carter wasn't finished. He took another step closer, breaching Henry's personal space, clearly attempting to escalate the situation. "I think you might find something more fitting for yourself over at the used car parts store," Carter continued, his voice cutting like a blade. "This place is for people who know what they're doing and actually have the means. You get what I'm saying?" Carter's words weren't just insults, they carried an unspoken message. He didn't believe that someone like Henry, with his rugged appearance and unpolished demeanor, could belong in this lavish environment. Carter was accustomed to dealing with clients who arrived in sharp suits, sporting luxury watches, stepping out of high-end cars. He had no patience or respect for anyone who didn't fit that mold. Other people in the showroom began to notice the exchange. A few customers cast discreet glances in their direction, their eyes a mix of curiosity and amusement. It was as if they were waiting to see how Henry would respond. Near the window, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "He must not know where he is. Looks like he just stepped off a muddy field." Henry could hear the murmurs, but he chose to remain silent. He understood that any rash reaction would only reinforce the stereotypes these people already held about him. Instead, he took a deep breath, keeping his gaze calm and his focus unwavering on the one thing that mattered, making his dream a reality. Sensing no immediate retaliation from Henry, Carter assumed he had the upper hand. His smirk grew wider, dripping with condescension. "Do you even want to know the price of this plane?" Carter drawled, dragging out the words to emphasize the perceived gap between them. "This isn't something someone like you can easily afford. I'd suggest you save your time and hours." Carter's words cut deep, a blatant attack on Henry's pride. But instead of breaking, Henry stood taller, his eyes gleaming with quiet determination. He didn't need to prove himself, not to Carter, not to anyone in the room. Yet, he couldn't have known that an even greater challenge awaited him just ahead. Henry struggled to maintain his focus, despite Carter's disdain lingering like a shadow in the air. He ran his hand across the sleek control panel of the airplane before him, feeling the refinement and modern technology it embodied. Yet the fragile silence was soon shattered by murmurs from other corners of the room. "He's probably just here to take pictures," muttered a woman near the reception desk, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She was dressed in an expensive gown, arms crossed over her chest as if she already knew the punchline of the comedy unfolding before her. "Pictures? I bet he thinks this is some kind of giveaway," an older man seated on a leather chair further back replied with a derisive chuckle. His laughter elicited a few agreeing smirks from those nearby, adding to the oppressive weight of the showroom's atmosphere. Henry could feel every gaze landing on him, not out of curiosity, but judgment and scorn. Some deliberately looked away when he glanced in their direction, but their mocking expressions were hard to miss. The murmurs grew louder, no longer veiled in subtlety. A young man near the reception counter spoke up with a sneer. "Look at the way he's dressed. Bet he thinks he belongs here. What a joke." The remarks didn't end there. Another customer, a middle-aged man with silver hair and thick glasses, shook his head and smirked. "Maybe he's here to apply for a cleaning job. Probably wants to polish the planes," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. This time, a few people laughed outright. But it wasn't just casual mockery anymore. Some of the comments carried an unmistakable racial undertone. A woman standing near a smaller aircraft shrugged and said to her companion, "I don't think this is a place for someone like him. Maybe he should stick to working in the fields." The words cut deep, like an invisible blade slicing into Henry's sense of dignity. The prejudice extended beyond mere looks or words. It attacked his very identity. A black man who had worked tirelessly to achieve what he knew he deserved. While Henry wasn't easily shaken, these remarks made him feel isolated in a room full of people. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress his emotions. He didn't respond, nor did he leave the room as they might have expected. Instead, he walked slowly toward another employee, intending to ask for more information about the airplane. But before he could speak, Carter, the staff member who had mocked him earlier, reappeared, wearing a malicious smirk. "Back again? What do you want this time?" Carter said, his tone as condescending as before. "I thought we made it clear, this isn't the place for you. These planes aren't just for looking at." Henry stared at Carter without flinching. There was no anger in his eyes, only resolve. "I'm not here just to look," he replied, his voice low and deliberate, emphasizing every word. But before he could say more, another sneer echoed from the corner of the room. "Yeah, let him dream," a male voice said, louder than before. "That's probably all he's good for." Henry felt his chest tighten, his hands clenched, not out of rage, but as an effort to keep control. He knew that losing his temper would only confirm their beliefs that he didn't belong here. But every cutting remark was like a wave crashing against him, testing the limits of his composure. Even so, a spark of determination ignited within him. It wasn't anger, but an unyielding resolve. He knew he couldn't let these words define him or deter him. Yet the question remained, how could he face the situation while preserving his dignity? That was the challenge he would have to confront with every step he took. Henry stood still, his eyes trying to maintain composure amidst the growing jeers. He felt as though every gaze in the room was drilling into him, as if they were waiting for him to crumble or walk away. Then, unexpectedly, he felt a gentle pat on his shoulder from behind. The gesture startled him just enough that he turned around, and standing before him was a familiar face. "Henry? I didn't expect to see you here." A warm and friendly voice broke through the tense atmosphere. Standing in front of him was Beckham, an old friend from high school. Like Henry, Beckham was also black, but his career path had taken him to a different station in life. His neatly trimmed hair, expensive gray suit, and polished leather shoes sharply contrasted with Henry's simpler appearance. Henry stared at Beckham for a few moments before exclaiming, "Beckham? Is it really you?" A rare smile lit up his face, one that hadn't appeared all day. Beckham smiled back, pulling Henry into a friendly hug. His presence seemed to soften the tense atmosphere around them slightly, though the scrutinizing eyes of the room hadn't yet turned away from the pair. "What are you doing here?" Beckham asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and encouragement. "Don't tell me you're here to buy a plane." He chuckled lightly, his eyes sparkling with respect rather than skepticism. Henry had encountered from anyone else in the room. Henry hesitated briefly, a flicker of embarrassment creeping into his heart. He felt the stark difference between himself and Beckham, not just in appearance, but in the way Beckham carried himself with such confidence in an environment like this, as though it belonged to him. Finally, Henry answered honestly, "Actually, yes. I'm here to buy a plane. But it seems like nobody here believes I can." Beckham glanced around at the people nearby, his eyes quickly sharpening. "The people here," he said with a firm tone. "You don't need to worry about them. They don't understand you, and honestly, they don't matter." His voice was resolute, but carried an undertone of encouragement. Henry gave a slight nod, though a hint of unease lingered in his eyes. "Didn't you hear what they were saying?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly. "The insults, those looks, they make me feel like I don't belong here." Beckham placed a hand on Henry's shoulder and looked him straight in the eye. "Henry, remember who you are. You've worked hard your entire life to get here. Their words don't define your worth, and they certainly can't stop you from achieving your dream." He paused, a smile returning to his face. "And I'm here to make sure you don't give up." Beckham's words were like a small flame igniting confidence within Henry. He felt the warmth of friendship, a feeling he hadn't experienced during this long pressure-filled day. The two friends began chatting for a while, and Henry felt some of the tension in his chest ease. Yet Beckham's presence also seemed to draw increasing attention from those around them. From across the room, Carter stood with his arms crossed, his icy gaze fixed on Beckham and Henry. A faint smirk of disdain crept across his face. Carter wasn't just annoyed that Henry was still here. Beckham's arrival, with his evident success and self-assurance, only added to Carter's irritation. "Looks like his friend is trying to act important too," Carter remarked to a colleague nearby, loud enough for others to hear. A few attendees began murmuring again, no longer focusing solely on Henry but now turning their scrutiny toward Beckham as well. Henry noticed this and leaned closer to Beckham, speaking softly. "You know, sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it. Those looks, they make me feel like I'm standing on a battlefield I can never win." Beckham shook his head firmly. "It's worth it, Henry. No one gets to decide your dream except you. If you give up, that's when they win. But if you stand your ground and keep going, you'll prove them wrong." Henry offered a faint smile, feeling as though a part of his strength had returned. Yet, he knew this challenge was far from over, not with Carter's piercing eyes or the venomous whispers that still circulated around them. Even so, Beckham's presence had rekindled his confidence. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least now, he no longer felt completely alone. Henry clenched his fists tightly as he stood next to Beckham, his gaze fixed on the airplane. Though his heart was bolstered with determination, the oppressive atmosphere of the showroom weighed heavily, like a storm on the verge of breaking. He decided it was time to leave. But just as he was about to step away, a voice shattered the fragile silence. "Do you think you can buy an airplane dressed like that?" The man's voice boomed, loud enough to make the nearby customers turn their heads. It was a middle-aged man in an expensive gray suit and polished leather shoes, clearly raising his voice intentionally to draw attention. He smirked, his eyes locked on Henry with an undisguised look of disdain. Henry stopped, his shoulders tensing, but he didn't turn around immediately. The man, realizing he had the audience he wanted, continued in an even more mocking tone. Seriously, just look at yourself. You should probably head back to your farm, that's where you belong. The man's words elicited a few chuckles from those nearby, faint but loud enough to echo throughout the showroom. A woman standing near the reception desk covered her mouth with her hand, though her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The mocking remarks seemed to fuel a wave of judgmental glances from every corner of the room, as if they were savoring a live drama. Beckham frowned, stepping forward as if to intervene, but Henry raised a hand to stop him. He knew his friend wanted to stand up for him, but this was a moment he needed to face on his own. Slowly, Henry turned his head, his eyes meeting the older man's gaze directly. "If you have something to say to me, just say it," Henry replied, his voice calm yet sharp. His words weren't loud, but they were piercing enough to silence the laughter around him, if only for a moment. The man seemed taken aback by Henry's retort, but quickly regained his composure. "Straightforward, huh?" he sneered. "All right, I'll be blunt. You look completely out of place here. This is a place for people who can actually afford their dreams, not for wishful thinking." A few people nearby nodded in agreement, as if the man had voiced what they were all thinking. Carter, standing a few steps away, crossed his arms and smirked coldly. He didn't say a word, but his silence seemed to encourage the man's venomous comments. Beckham, unable to hold back any longer, stepped forward and confronted the man. "I don't recall there being a rule that says someone can't buy an airplane based on how they dress or what they do for a living," he said coldly. "Or is it that you think you have the right to decide who belongs here?" The man chuckled dismissively, though his eyes flickered with irritation. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking," he replied with a shrug. "But if you're his friend, it's no wonder. Do you even know where you are? This isn't a place for taking chances." Beckham started to speak again, but Henry stepped forward. He knew this was his moment to speak, not for them, but for himself. "I know exactly where I am," Henry said, his voice low but steady. "I'm here to buy an airplane, and I don't need anyone's approval in this room to do it." The words hung in the air, freezing the atmosphere in the showroom. The older man hesitated for a moment, though his arrogance kept him rooted in place. "Oh really?" he scoffed. "Then show us what you've got. But remember, not everyone is cut out for big things." Henry didn't respond immediately. He held the man's gaze unwavering. Finally, he turned to Beckham. "Let's go," he said, his tone calm but resolute. Yet within him, a fire burned, a fire of pride and unyielding determination. The showroom fell into a heavy silence as Henry and Beckham walked out. But the silence wasn't one of respect. It was a silence of anticipation, as if they were waiting for Henry to fail. And Henry knew, this was just the beginning of a battle he couldn't afford to lose. Henry and Beckham had barely stepped away from the airplane when a mocking laugh echoed from behind them, clear, sharp, and laden with challenge. The sound pierced Henry's patience like a dagger. The middle-aged man, the source of the taunt, raised an eyebrow and smirked, his voice carrying across the showroom with derision. "Oh, you're leaving already? I thought someone as ambitious as you might try to prove something. But perhaps I overestimated my expectations." Henry froze, his hands clenching tightly at his sides. This time, he couldn't let it slide. He turned around slowly, his steps deliberate and resolute, heading back toward the man. The room fell silent, and every eye turned toward him. "What do you want me to prove?" Henry's voice was deep and steady, yet it carried an undeniable authority. His eyes gleamed with newfound confidence, free of hesitation or doubt. "I didn't come here to please anyone in this room. I came to get what I know I deserve." His words rang out like a bell, shattering the oppressive atmosphere of contempt. The middle-aged man's eyes flickered with momentary surprise before his sneer returned. "Nice speech," the man shrugged dismissively, "but we all know talk doesn't buy anything." A faint smile crossed Henry's lips, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the smile of someone who had been underestimated far too often, but had always found a way to rise above. Slowly, he reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and pulled out a check. He held it up high for everyone in the room to see. The number on it caused gasps to ripple through the crowd. It matched the exact value of the airplane. Henry had been inspecting the room when it fell into a stunned silence. The murmurs, the mocking laughter, and the disdainful glances vanished as if they had never existed. The middle-aged man swallowed hard, his gaze shifting between the check and Henry's unwavering expression, struggling to process what he was seeing. Carter, the salesman, stood frozen in place, his hand gripping the edge of the display counter. The smug confidence on Carter's face dissolved into confusion and unease. Henry took another step forward and extended the check toward the middle-aged man.
You're right. Words don't buy anything.
But money does, he said, his tone calm yet razor-sharp. And I have what it takes to turn my dreams into reality. So, do you have anything else to say? The man's mouth opened, but no words came out. Henry lowered the check, his gaze sweeping across the room. The once derisive stares now avoided his. To me, what any of you think doesn't matter, Henry continued, his voice gaining strength. What matters is that I know who I am, and I know what I deserve. If anyone in this room believes I don't belong here, they should take a hard look at themselves. His words struck a nerve, leaving an unmistakable mark on the room. Behind him, Beckham smiled with quiet pride. Carter, visibly flustered, finally stepped forward, attempting to salvage the situation. Sir, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding, Carter stammered, his tone devoid of its earlier sarcasm and replaced by nervousness. If you're genuinely interested in purchasing the aircraft, we'd be happy to assist you. Henry turned to Carter, his gaze as sharp as a blade. A misunderstanding? No, there's been no misunderstanding. I think you're fully aware of the attitude you've displayed toward me since the moment I walked in. Let me make this clear, I don't need your assistance. I'll buy the plane from a place that understands how to respect its customers. Henry's final words ended all argument. He turned and walked away, his steps slow but filled with dignity, leaving behind a room engulfed in awkward silence and discomfort. Yet within him, a fire of determination burned brighter than ever. He wasn't just standing up for himself, he was making it known that no one had the right to judge another's worth based solely on appearances. Henry left the gallery, but his heart could not find peace. The stares, the insults, and their disdain were like knives carving deep into his mind. Standing by his old pickup truck, he gripped his phone tightly. Pausing for a moment, he took a deep breath and dialed Marcus, his son. Not long after, Marcus arrived at the airport. His charcoal gray suit was impeccably tailored, his polished black leather shoes gleamed, and his perfectly knotted tie stood out with its flawless precision. His piercing eyes scanned the gallery quickly, locating his father standing quietly near the entrance. "Dad," Marcus called out, his voice deep yet commanding. Henry turned, seeing his son striding toward him with broad shoulders and steady steps that carried an air of justice. Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder, his eyes filled with both empathy and determination. "Are you all right?" Henry nodded faintly, but his silence spoke volumes. Marcus's gaze darkened as he glanced toward the gallery, where a few people continued murmuring, though more subdued now. Now Carter, the sales associate, avoided Marcus's gaze, but his unease was evident. Marcus entered the gallery like a storm. Curious looks quickly turned into wary glances. He stopped at the reception desk, where Carter was trying to maintain a composed facade. "Are you the one in charge here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but laden with authority. Carter flinched, forcing a thin, nervous smile. I'm just a sales associate," Carter stammered. "If you're looking for more information." "That's enough," Marcus cut him off, his gaze icy. "You thought you had the right to treat my father that way. Your words, and the words of those here, weren't just insulting. They were blatantly discriminatory. I expect an apology. Now." The tension in the room was palpable. Carter began to sweat, his eyes darting toward other customers as if seeking support, but no one dared to intervene. The middle-aged man who had mocked Henry earlier stepped back, his arrogance draining from his face. "Listen," Carter stuttered, trying to steady his voice. "We didn't mean any harm. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Marcus's tone sharpened. "A misunderstanding that you looked down on my father simply because he was dressed differently? A misunderstanding that you thought you had the right to decide who belongs here?" Carter froze, unable to reply. Others in the room, including the customers who had joined in the ridicule, avoided Marcus's piercing gaze. Silence enveloped the space, broken only by Marcus's firm voice. "If there isn't an apology right now, I won't let this slide," Marcus declared. "I'm a lawyer. My father wasn't just insulted, He was subjected to blatant discrimination in a public business setting. I will pursue legal action against you and this company if necessary. A few whispers rippled through the room, but no one dared to oppose him. Carter swallowed hard, his face pale. Finally, he awkwardly bowed his head toward Henry. Sir, I apologize if my words offended you. Henry met Carter's eyes, his expression no longer angry but steady and resolute. This apology isn't for me. It's a lesson for you all, to learn how to treat everyone with respect, no matter how they look or where they come from. Marcus stood silently beside his father, his gaze still stern. He turned to the group of customers who had mocked Henry earlier. What about you? Did you think you had the right to laugh at my father just because he's not like you? No one responded. The middle-aged man who had been the loudest earlier mumbled incoherently before quickly lowering his head. A few others hurriedly found excuses to leave the gallery, unwilling to face Marcus any longer. Marcus turned back to his father and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Dad, let's go. They've seen enough. Yet within Marcus, a fire of resolve continued to burn. He knew this wasn't just a single act of disrespect, it was a deeper issue. One he was determined to fight so that no one would ever dare to look down on his father again. When Henry and Marcus left the airport, the weight of what had happened still lingered, but so did their unshaken dignity. It seemed the matter had ended there, but for Marcus, this was far more than a personal conflict. It was an insult to his father's dignity, honor, and human rights, and he was determined to bring it to light. A few weeks later, a lawsuit was officially filed in the local court. The company owning the aircraft showroom was accused of discriminatory practices and humiliating a customer, specifically Henry. Marcus led the legal team, crafting a solid case with an arsenal of evidence, witnesses, and compelling arguments. At the first hearing, the courtroom was packed. Representatives of the company, attorneys, and involved employees were all present, including Carter, the man who had directly mocked Henry. Carter's face was visibly tense as he sat quietly with the company's legal team, avoiding Marcus's piercing gaze. Marcus began his opening statement with a calm but powerful tone. Your Honor, he said, his eyes scanning the room, we are here today to shed light on a painful truth. Discrimination not only exists, but is being tolerated in modern business environments. My father, Henry, was subjected to an unacceptable act, an act no one in this society should have to endure. The company's attorney immediately rose to object. Your Honor, we believe this case has been exaggerated. The remarks Mr. Henry overheard were mere misunderstandings, not intended to offend or discriminate. Marcus remained undeterred. Misunderstandings. He emphasized each syllable, his sharp eyes locking on the opposing team. We have clear evidence that this was no misunderstanding, but a deliberate attempt to humiliate and demean my father. And I will prove that now. Marcus signaled for a young woman to take the witness stand. It was Patricia, an employee at the aircraft showroom. She was the only staff member who had discreetly recorded the incident, unable to bear her colleague's mistreatment of Henry. Patricia, can you recount what you witnessed that day? Marcus asked, his voice low yet commanding. Patricia took a deep breath, her gaze briefly landing on Carter, who now looked as though he wanted to shrink into his seat. I saw everything, she said firmly. Carter and some customers made discriminatory remarks toward Mr. Henry. They mocked him for his appearance and profession. I couldn't stay silent, so I secretly recorded the conversation. Marcus nodded, a hint of a confident smile crossing his face. Do you have that recording? Patricia nodded and handed her phone to Marcus. He connected it to the courtroom's audio system. As the recording played, the room fell into a heavy silence. The mocking voices of Carter and the customers rang out clearly. You think you can afford a plane dressed like that? Go back to your farm. He probably thinks this is a charity giveaway. Each statement cut through the room like a knife, leaving the air thick with tension. Carter stared at the table, his face pale, while the company's attorneys tried to maintain composure, though it was evident they had little left to argue. When the recording ended, Marcus stepped forward, addressing the judge directly. Your Honor, this is not a misunderstanding. This is discrimination, a deliberate assault on my father's dignity. And it's not just my father, Henry, who is a victim. Anyone who looks different from their ideal customer could easily become a target. The company's lawyer stood to counter. We do not deny that those remarks were inappropriate. However, The company cannot be held accountable for individual actions that were neither sanctioned nor reflective of management policy. Marcus turned sharply, his gaze like a laser cutting through the opposition's defense. The company cannot evade responsibility, he said, his tone calm yet razor-sharp. This isn't just about individual behavior. This is about the environment the company fosters, an environment that tolerates and fails to address such conduct. If the company doesn't take responsibility, then who will? The judge, seated at the high bench, nodded slowly. The evidence is very clear, he said gravely. We will proceed with this case to determine the extent of the company's and the individual's responsibilities. But I must say, what I've heard so far is deeply troubling. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Marcus turned to look at his father, his eyes filled with determination. Henry gave a subtle nod, a silent expression of pride in his son. Yet Marcus knew the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning of the journey to justice. When the recording played in the courtroom, all eyes turned toward the speaker. Each sarcastic remark and heavy mockery echoed clearly. Do you think you can buy a plane in that suit?
Go back to your farm. It eats you better.
He probably thinks this place gives out freebies. Those words sliced through the air like knives, thickening the atmosphere in the courtroom. They weren't just insults. They carried a distinct prejudice against Henry, not only for his appearance but also for his background. Henry's face remained calm, but his hands clenched tightly on his lap, as if to keep himself from showing the pain. Patricia, seated at the witness stand, took a deep breath before speaking. These words aren't just offensive, they reflect the attitude Mr. Henry endured the moment he stepped into that showroom. I work there, and I witnessed it all. What you just heard is the truth, and it happens daily to those they deem unworthy of being there. Across the room, the company's lawyers fidgeted at the damning evidence. One of them, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, rose to his feet, attempting damage control. Your Honor, we do not deny that these remarks are inappropriate. However, we contend that this was an individual act and does not represent the company's policies or values. Marcus immediately stood, his expression cold and firm. Does not represent the company, he emphasized each word, his voice resonating with conviction. Your Honor, this is an environment where such behavior is tolerated. Carter, the salesperson, was not the only one making those comments. He was supported by approving glances from his colleagues and even customers in the showroom. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a systemic issue. The company's lawyer struggled to maintain composure, but their discomfort was evident. We will implement additional training for employees and enforce stricter oversight moving forward, another lawyer said, attempting to redirect the issue. Marcus wasn't about to let them off so easily. Training alone won't suffice, he said, his gaze piercing through the opposing team. My father is not the first person to be treated this way, and unless significant actions are taken, he won't be the last. This company must take responsibility, not just for the words spoken, but for the systemic silence that enables such behavior. The judge, an older woman with a stern expression, finally spoke. After listening to the recording and arguments from both sides, the evidence we've just heard clearly demonstrates that Mr. Henry was subjected to unfair and discriminatory treatment. This cannot be dismissed as an individual's actions. The company has a duty to create a fair business environment, one that does not tolerate such behavior. She turned to the company's legal team. I advise you to reconsider your stance before we proceed. Do you wish to continue arguing, or would you consider discussing a reasonable settlement? The company's lawyers conferred hurriedly, their concern evident. But Marcus wasn't finished. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm but firm, my father didn't come here for a token apology or some superficial training measures. He came here to reclaim the respect and dignity that were stripped from him. And we won't stop until justice is served. The courtroom fell silent for a moment. Carter sat motionless, his face pale. The company's lawyers exchanged yet another hurried discussion before one of them stood. We are willing to discuss settlement terms, he said, his voice low and reluctant. The judge nodded. Good. We will proceed with settlement discussions in the next session. But let me remind you, if a satisfactory resolution is not reached, this case will proceed to trial, and I will ensure justice is served. Marcus turned to Henry, a faint smile on his lips. We're on the right track, Dad, he whispered, his eyes shining with pride. But he knew this was just the first step in their fight for justice. The battle was far from over, and he wouldn't stop until everything was set right. On the final morning of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Rows of seats were filled with reporters, witnesses, and curious onlookers, drawn by the case that had captivated public attention. Standing at the plaintiff's side, Henry and Marcus maintained a composed demeanor, though they knew this was the pivotal moment. The judge entered, her expression stern and her gaze sharp, as if she had meticulously weighed every piece of evidence. After a few moments of silence to settle the room, she began to deliver the verdict. Members of the court, after thoroughly reviewing all the evidence and hearing testimonies from both sides, I have reached the conclusion that Mr. Henry has endured severe discrimination in a public business setting. The recorded statements presented in court are not only personally offensive, but also reveal a culture of disrespect and tolerance for misconduct within the defendant company. The judge paused, her eyes scanning the defense team, increasing the tension in the room. She continued. This behavior violates fundamental principles of fair business practices and is contrary to existing laws regarding human rights and anti-discrimination. The company's legal team lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact. Carter, who had been at the center of the controversy, sat silently, his face pale. Some of the clients who had joined in mocking Henry were also present, now trying to avoid the stares of others in the courtroom. The judge's voice became firmer as she went on. Therefore, I declare that the defendant company is directly responsible for acts of discrimination and harassment against Mr. Henry. The company is ordered to pay a substantial fine of $500,000. This amount will be used to compensate Mr. Henry and fund programs promoting equality and combating racism. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. It was a hefty penalty that would undoubtedly impact the company's reputation and operations. But that wasn't the end. In addition, the judge said, her authoritative tone brooking no argument, the company is required to implement mandatory training programs on equality and anti-discrimination for all employees. These programs will be supervised by an independent body to ensure their effectiveness. This measure is not just to address the harm caused, but to prevent such incidents from happening again. Marcus nodded slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. This was what he had hoped for from the start, not just financial compensation, but a change in the company's culture and attitude. Finally, the judge turned her gaze to the company's representatives, her face reflecting clear disappointment. I also mandate that the company issue a public apology to Mr. Henry, both in writing and across public media platforms. An apology is not just an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, it is the first step toward rebuilding trust with the community. The room fell silent again, save for the rustling of the judge's papers as she completed her statement. This court is adjourned, she declared, striking her gavel firmly. Henry turned to Marcus, his eyes filled with gratitude and pride. You did it, he said softly, his voice choked with emotion. Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder, his own eyes gleaming with determination. This is justice, Dad, he replied, his voice steady and resolute. On the other side, Carter quietly slipped out of the courtroom, his face ashen and his eyes troubled. The company's legal team packed up their materials in silence, aware that the verdict was not just a punishment but a costly lesson. As Henry and Marcus stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight seemed brighter. A throng of reporters quickly surrounded them, cameras flashing incessantly. But Henry paid them no mind. All he felt was relief and pride that at last, his dignity had been upheld. Standing beside his father, Marcus looked out at the crowd and spoke a single powerful sentence. Justice is not just something we seek, it is something everyone deserves. And today, justice was served. The morning sunlight illuminated the airport grounds, reflecting brilliantly off the luxurious planes displayed outdoors. Stepping out of a sleek SUV, Henry, clad in a tailored suit and polished leather shoes, slowly made his way into the showroom where everything had begun. Today, Henry was no longer the man in a faded shirt and mud-streaked boots from years ago. He walked with confidence, each step echoing a silent proclamation that he had overcome every insult, every disdainful look, and every prejudice cast upon him by the people in this very room. Walking beside him was Marcus, his expression stern but his eyes gleaming with pride. As Henry entered, the room seemed to freeze. The employees who had once mocked him fell silent, their gazes awkwardly shifting, unsure of where to rest. Carter, the leader of the group that had ridiculed Henry the most, now stood behind the counter, his shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to shrink into himself. The arrogance that once defined him was gone, replaced by a flicker of unease as his eyes briefly met Henry's before darting away. Henry strode to the center of the showroom, stopping in front of Carter and a few other colleagues. He swept his gaze over each of them, his eyes calm yet radiating an unmistakable confidence. A faint smile played on his lips, not one of forgiveness, but a quiet assertion of victory. "Do you remember me?" Henry's voice rang out, deep and steady, filling the room. His question hung in the air, and the only response he received was a series of hesitant nods.
No wonder to speak.
"The last time I walked out of here," Henry continued, his tone deliberate, each word pressing against the memories they wished to bury, "you laughed, mocked, and judged me based on my appearance. But today, I'm not here to buy a plane from you. I'm here to remind you that prejudices and attitudes like those are not only wrong but also incapable of diminishing anyone's worth." Carter opened his mouth to speak, but Henry raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't need an apology. The court has already spoken for me. What I want you to remember is this: every customer who walks through that door deserves respect, no matter how they look, what they wear, or where they come from." Henry turned away, his gaze settling on another display area showcasing the logo of a rival company, a brand that also sold planes but had no connection to the incident before. He smiled confidently and glanced at Marcus. "Let's go," Henry said, his voice gentle but resolute. He walked toward the competitor's area, where a staff member greeted him with a polite smile and genuine respect. "I'd like to see your finest PLS," Henry said, his tone professional yet firm, making it clear he was a man capable of making significant decisions. The employees in the original showroom could only watch, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and regret. Carter lowered his head, his hands gripping the edge of the counter tightly, as if realizing that his attitude had cost the company not just a wealthy client, but also someone of considerable influence. An hour later, Henry emerged from the rival company's section with Marcus by his side. He had just signed a contract for a new plane, the dream aircraft he had once been mocked for aspiring to own. The sense of triumph lay not only in acquiring what he desired but also in doing so on his own terms, without bowing to anyone. Henry glanced back at the old showroom, where those who had ridiculed him now stood quietly like shadows weighed down by remorse. He offered them a fleeting smile before turning away, leaving behind everything that had once sought to diminish his worth. In the clear blue sky above, the plane Henry had just purchased awaited him, ready to take him anywhere he wished, a symbol of freedom, self-respect, and the unwavering resolve to rise above prejudice. The aircraft glided smoothly across the sky, its sleek body reflecting the radiant sunlight, highlighting the logo of a rival company, one that had treated Henry with the respect and professionalism he deserved. Sitting in the spacious cabin, Henry gazed out the window, his eyes brimming with pride and fulfillment. Beside him sat Marcus, the steadfast friend who had stood by him through this challenging journey. The plane slowly descended onto familiar land, where Henry's family awaited him. As the aircraft door opened, he stepped out to the warm embrace of his wife and children. Their beaming smile said it all, not just the joy of seeing him achieve his dream, but the pride in his fight to uphold his dignity and honor. His wife stepped forward, taking his hand, her eyes sparkling with admiration. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with encouragement and boundless love. His children, dressed neatly, rushed to hug him, calling his name with a mix of reverence and joy. That evening, the Henry family gathered around the dining table, the warm glow of the lights filling the room. Their conversation was not just about the triumph, but also the valuable lessons learned from Henry's arduous journey. He recounted the scornful looks, the harsh words, and how he faced them with unwavering confidence and determination. "I'm not a perfect man," Henry said, his gaze meeting each family member's, "but I've always believed that no one has the right to define our worth except ourselves. What I did was not just for my dream, but to prove that we can overcome any prejudice as long as we don't give up." Marcus, seated beside his father, nodded slightly. "And justice doesn't come naturally," he added. "We must stand up for it, fight for it, and never stay silent in the face of injustice." Elsewhere, the antagonists of this story faced the consequences of their actions. Carter, once arrogant and full of hubris, was no longer employed at the aircraft showroom. The company, after substantial fines and stringent court oversight, had to overhaul its training and operations entirely. The painful lessons were not just documented in reports, but etched into the memories of everyone involved. Customers who had joined in mocking Henry now reflected on their behavior. No longer laughing, they carried with them a sense of shame and an unforgettable lesson about how to treat others. Henry's story didn't end with purchasing his dream airplane. it became a powerful reminder of standing up against prejudice and racism in society. He wasn't just fighting for himself, but for those who lacked the voice or strength to confront injustice. That day, as Henry boarded his airplane once more, he carried not just the realization of a dream, but the pride of a journey that proved determination and self-respect could break any barrier. Soaring through the azure skies, his airplane wasn't merely a mode of transport, but a symbol of the power of justice and faith in oneself. Henry's journey was more than a tale of buying an airplane. It was a profound lesson in resilience, self-respect, and courage in the face of injustice. It reminds us that, regardless of judgment or scorn, a person's worth lies not in the eyes of others, but in their own belief and relentless effort. What about you? If you were in Henry's position, how would you react? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more meaningful content, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to never miss any future videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.